On June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over the Normandy coast, over 1,000 small wooden boats approached 5 invasion beaches through choppy seas and German fire. Each boat, measuring 36 feet long and built of plywood and marine glue, carried 36 heavily armed soldiers toward fortified enemy positions. The boats raced toward shore at 12 knots, grounded on sand or shingle, and dropped their bow ramps, allowing troops to charge directly onto French soil. Within hours, 140,000 Allied soldiers had landed, establishing the beachhead that would liberate Western Europe. Every history of D-Day mentions these boats, the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, universally known as Higgins boats. Few histories mention that the United States Navy had fought for years to prevent their adoption, preferring its own inferior designs. Fewer still mention that Andrew Jackson Higgins, the irascible New Orleans boat builder who designed them, had to battle bureaucracy as fiercely as his boats battled the surf. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born on August 28, 1886, in Columbus, Nebraska, the son of a circuit court judge and newspaper publisher. He grew up fascinated by mechanics and boats, though Nebraska's landlocked location offered limited opportunities to pursue either interest. After high school, he attended Creighton University in Omaha, but left without graduating, drawn instead to practical work. He moved to Mobile, Alabama around 1906, working in the timber and shipping industries. By 1910, he had founded his own lumber import-export business, establishing a small shipyard to service his fleet. The lumber business thrived briefly, but intense competition and economic pressures drove it under by the early 1920s. Higgins kept the shipyard, pivoting to boat construction full-time. He had found his calling. In 1922, Higgins moved his operation to New Orleans, a city surrounded by swamps, bayous, and the vast Mississippi River Delta. The region's economy depended on oil and gas extraction, trapping, logging, and fishing, all conducted in shallow, debris-filled waters where conventional boats struggled. Propellers fouled on submerged logs, flat-bottomed boats grounded on sandbars. Deep-draft vessels couldn't navigate the narrow channels. Higgins saw opportunity. He began designing boats specifically for Louisiana's unique conditions: shallow draft to operate in minimal water, protected propellers to avoid damage, and powerful engines to push through vegetation and debris. His boats were fast, maneuverable, and tough. They could ram onto muddy riverbanks, unload cargo, and reverse back into the water without assistance. By 1926, Higgins had perfected his design, which he called the Eureka. The name came from the moment of discovery when a foreman accidentally built a hull with a concave aft section, solving the cavitation problem that had plagued earlier designs. The Eureka featured a tunnel-shaped recess in the hull that protected the propeller, allowing it to operate in just 3 feet of water. The bow was shaped like a spoonbill, flat and reinforced, designed to ram onto beaches or riverbanks without damage. The boat could carry heavy loads, reach high speeds, and turn almost in its own length. Higgins sold Eurekas to oil drillers, trappers, and bootleggers who needed fast, reliable craft for navigating the bayous. The Great Depression nearly destroyed his business, but Higgins survived by relentless cost-cutting and diversification. In the mid-1930s, the United States Marine Corps began searching for a boat capable of amphibious landings. Existing landing craft were slow, clumsy, and poorly suited to beaching operations. Most had V-shaped hulls that grounded on reefs or sandbars far from shore, forcing Marines to wade through deep water under fire. The Navy's Bureau of Ships designed several prototypes, but all failed operational tests. In 1937, Marine Corps officers attending maneuvers at Fleet Landing Exercise No. 3, Flex 3, watched existing landing craft struggle and fail. Around the same time, a Marine observer in China, Lieutenant Victor Krulak, witnessed Japanese forces using Daihatsu-class landing craft during the Battle of Shanghai. The Japanese boats had bow ramps that dropped down, allowing troops and vehicles to disembark directly onto the beach without climbing over high gunwales. Krulak sent photographs and reports back to Marine Corps headquarters. Marine Corps officers learned about Higgins boats through the Coast Guard, which had purchased several Eurekas for rescue and patrol operations. In 1938, the Marine Corps invited Higgins to participate in a competition at Quantico, Virginia, testing boats from multiple manufacturers. Higgins arrived with his Eureka, confident it would outperform the Navy's designs. He was proved correct. The Higgins boat ran onto beaches at full speed, reversed off without difficulty, and operated reliably in rough water. The Navy's boat, designed by the Bureau of Ships, failed spectacularly. It grounded far from shore, couldn't reverse, and required assistance to extract. Marines watching the trials were convinced the Higgins boat was superior. The Navy's Bureau of Ships disagreed, insisting that its own designs were adequate and that a civilian contractor from New Orleans couldn't possibly understand naval requirements. The conflict between Higgins and the Navy's Bureau of Ships became bitter and personal. Bureau officials saw Higgins as an outsider, a small-time boat builder without formal training or naval experience. Higgins, for his part, was bombastic, profane, and unapologetically aggressive. He called Bureau officials incompetent bureaucrats who couldn't design a rowboat. He lobbied Congress, the White House, and senior military officers, bypassing the Navy's procurement process entirely. He demonstrated his boats publicly, invited journalists to witness trials, and ridiculed the Navy's failures in print. The Bureau retaliated by awarding contracts to established shipyards, ordering more tests, and imposing design changes intended to sabotage Higgins' boats. The feud consumed years and delayed the adoption of landing craft that would prove essential to American victory. In 1940, with war looming, the Marine Corps finally forced a decisive trial. On September 11, 1940, Higgins' boats competed directly against the Navy Bureau's designs in a public demonstration. The results were unambiguous. The Higgins boat completed every task flawlessly. The Bureau's boat couldn't even reach the beach. Faced with undeniable evidence, the Navy awarded Higgins Industries a contract on November 18, 1940 for landing craft. Personnel, large, or LCPL. The boats were 36 feet long, carried 36 troops, and could operate in shallow water, but they still had one critical flaw. Soldiers had to climb over the gunwales to disembark, exposing them to fire while vulnerable. The Marine Corps wanted a bow ramp, like the Japanese Daihatsu. In April 1941, Marine officers showed Higgins photographs of the Japanese landing craft and asked if he could add a bow ramp to his design. Higgins studied the photos and agreed immediately, promising to build a prototype at his own expense. Within weeks, he had converted a standard Eureka into a ramp bow boat. In May 1941, Higgins demonstrated the modified design, now called landing craft, personnel, ramp, or LCPR, on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. The ramp lowered smoothly, troops disembarked directly onto the beach, and the boat reversed back into the water without difficulty. The Marines were thrilled. The Navy reluctantly agreed. By June 1941, the LCPR had passed official acceptance tests and production began. Over 2,500 were built and deployed across the Pacific and Mediterranean. Higgins continued refining the design. The LCPR was excellent for troops, but it couldn't carry vehicles. In late 1941, Higgins developed the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, or LCVP, combining the troop capacity of the LCPR with the ability to carry a jeep or light truck. The LCVP could transport 36 combat-equipped soldiers, or a jeep with 12 troops, or 8,100 pounds of cargo. It was crewed by four, a coxswain, an engineer, and two machine gunners operating Browning 1919.30 caliber guns mounted on each side of the bow ramp. The boat was 36 feet long, 10.5 feet wide, with a draft of just 3 feet forward and 4 feet aft. It could reach 12 knots and operate in rough seas that swamped smaller craft. The LCVP became the standard landing craft for the United States military. The LCVP was built primarily of plywood, a material the Navy initially dismissed as inadequate. Higgins had purchased the entire 1939 production of Philippine mahogany, storing it in his New Orleans warehouses in anticipation of war. The wood proved ideal, light, strong, and easy to work. The boats were assembled quickly using prefabricated sections, allowing Higgins Industries to produce them at astonishing rates. At peak production, Higgins' New Orleans facilities employed over 20,000 workers, operating around the clock. The company built over 20,000 landing craft of various types during the war, more than any other manufacturer. Higgins also built 199 PT boats, motor torpedo boats used for fast attack missions. His factories became the largest producer of small military vessels in the world. Higgins Industries was also a pioneer in workforce integration. At a time when racial segregation was enforced by law in the South, Higgins hired black workers, women, and anyone willing to work hard, paying equal wages for equal work. He ignored protests from segregationists, famously declaring that he would hire anyone who could build boats. His factories were among the most integrated workplaces in America during World War II. Higgins believed that winning the war required using every available resource, including human talent that others wasted through prejudice. His hiring practices made him enemies in New Orleans, but they also made his factories extraordinarily productive. The LCVP saw its first major combat in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Thousands of troops landed on Moroccan and Algerian beaches using Higgins boats, establishing footholds for the campaign that would drive Axis forces from Africa. In July 1943, Higgins boats carried Allied troops onto Sicily's beaches. In September 1943, they landed at Salerno, Italy. Each operation refined tactics and revealed weaknesses, which Higgins incorporated into improved designs. The boats proved reliable, versatile, and essential. Generals who had never heard of Andrew Higgins before the war were now demanding thousands of his boats. In the Pacific, Higgins boats enabled the island-hopping campaign that drove Japanese forces back across thousands of miles. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marines stormed ashore in Higgins boats. At Tarawa in November 1943, the boats landed troops on heavily fortified beaches under murderous fire. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, wave after wave of Higgins boats delivered Marines onto volcanic sand and coral reefs. The boat's shallow draft allowed them to navigate reefs that stopped other craft. Their bow ramps allowed rapid disembarkation, critical when every second under fire mattered. Casualty rates were horrific, but without Higgins boats, the landings would have been impossible. The pinnacle of the Higgins boat service came on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Over 1,089 LCVPs participated in the Normandy landings, carrying American troops to Utah and Omaha beaches. The boats circled offshore before dawn, waiting for the signal to attack. At 05:30, they formed into waves and charged toward the beaches through heavy seas and German artillery fire. Many boats were hit. Some capsized in rough water, others struck underwater obstacles and sank. But most reached the beaches, dropped their ramps, and delivered their soldiers. On Omaha Beach, where German defenses were strongest, Higgins boats landed under withering machine gun and mortar fire. Ramps dropped into a killing zone, and soldiers charged forward, many dying before they reached cover. Yet the boats kept coming, wave after wave, until over 34,000 troops had landed on Omaha alone. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, reflected on the invasion years later during an interview with historian Stephen Ambrose. Eisenhower said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." The statement was not hyperbole. Without Higgins boats, the Allies would have needed to capture ports before landing troops, a far more difficult and time-consuming strategy. Amphibious assaults over open beaches were only possible because Higgins had solved the problems of shallow water navigation, protected propellers, and bow ramp deployment. Despite his contributions, Higgins faced constant harassment from the Navy's Bureau of Ships throughout the war. Bureau officials questioned his production methods, demanded design changes, and delayed payments. They awarded contracts to competitors whenever possible, even when those competitors produced inferior boats. Higgins responded by appealing directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who intervened on several occasions to ensure Higgins received contracts and funding. Roosevelt understood that Higgins boats were essential to Allied strategy and refused to let bureaucratic feuds jeopardize the war effort. But the constant battles exhausted Higgins, consuming energy and resources that could have been devoted to production. After the war, Higgins Industries collapsed. Military contracts evaporated overnight. The company, which had employed over 20,000 workers at its peak, laid off thousands. Higgins tried to pivot to commercial production, building boats for recreational and commercial markets, but demand was insufficient. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1946. Higgins, devastated by the collapse of the empire he had built, struggled financially for the rest of his life. He died on August 1, 1952, at age 65, largely forgotten by the public and unrecognized by the government he had served. His obituaries mentioned his wartime contributions, but few Americans remembered the man Eisenhower had called the man who won the war. The Higgins boat's legacy endured. After World War II, LCVP designs influenced amphibious craft worldwide. The boats were used during the Korean War, including the Incheon landing in 1950, where they performed as brilliantly as they had at Normandy. They saw service in Vietnam, Lebanon, and dozens of smaller conflicts. Modern amphibious assault craft, far more sophisticated with steel hulls, powerful engines, and advanced navigation systems, still use the basic principles Higgins established: shallow draft, protected propellers, and bow ramps for rapid deployment. The LCVP established the template for amphibious warfare that remains standard today. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, co-founded by historian Stephen Ambrose, honors Higgins as one of the key figures whose innovations made Allied victory possible. The museum displays restored Higgins boats and tells the story of Higgins Industries, the integrated workforce, and the mass production that supplied the war effort. Eisenhower's quote about Higgins is prominently featured, ensuring that visitors understand the critical role landing craft played in Allied strategy. The museum's location in New Orleans, the city where Higgins built his empire, connects the story to the place that made it possible. Andrew Higgins was not a trained naval architect. He had no formal engineering degree and never attended the Naval Academy. He was a self-taught boat builder who solved problems through experimentation, observation, and relentless testing. His boat succeeded because he understood the requirements better than the Navy's designers. He had spent years building craft for Louisiana's swamps and bayous, learning what worked through trial and error. When the Marines needed boats for amphibious landings, Higgins already knew how to build them. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, staffed by credentialed engineers, designed boats based on theory and tradition. Higgins designed boats based on what worked. The story of Andrew Higgins and the LCVP fits the pattern seen throughout history. Innovators outside established institutions develop solutions to problems that establishment experts cannot solve. The establishment resists, protecting its own designs and reputations. Watson Watt's radar was dismissed by the Air Ministry. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked by biplane advocates. Brunel's ships and bridges were called extravagant. Harrison's chronometer was rejected by the Royal Society. Semmelweis's hand-washing was scorned by doctors. The Wright brothers were ignored by the Army. Holt's tractors were adapted for war, despite institutional indifference. And Higgins' boats were opposed by the Navy Bureau of Ships until overwhelming evidence forced their adoption. In each case, lives were saved and wars were won, because someone outside the system refused to accept that the system knew best. The Navy that dismissed Higgins eventually recognized its error, but only after years of resistance. By the time the Bureau of Ships accepted Higgins' boats, thousands of Marines had died using inferior landing craft in the Pacific. The delay cost lives, wasted resources, and jeopardized operations. The Bureau's insistence on its own designs, despite clear evidence of their inadequacy, reflected institutional arrogance. Bureaucracies defend their decisions even when those decisions are wrong, because admitting error threatens authority. Higgins forced the Navy to confront its failures by producing boats that worked so well that rejection became indefensible. Higgins' boats didn't just enable D-Day, they enabled the entire strategy of amphibious warfare that defined the Allied campaigns in both Europe and the Pacific. Without the ability to land troops over open beaches, the Allies would have been forced to capture heavily defended ports, a far slower and costlier approach. Higgins' boats gave Allied commanders flexibility, allowing them to attack where the enemy was weakest, bypassing fortified positions and maintaining momentum. The strategic implications were enormous. The war might have lasted years longer without Higgins' boats. Casualties would have been far higher. The outcome might have been different. Andrew Jackson Higgins built boats for swamps and won a war. He never sought fame, never asked for recognition, and never received the honor he deserved during his lifetime. He fought the Navy's bureaucracy as fiercely as his boats fought the surf, and he won both battles, though the victories brought him little reward. He died broke and largely forgotten, his company bankrupt, his contributions overlooked. Yet every soldier who landed on a beach in World War II owed their life to Higgins. Every general who planned an amphibious assault relied on Higgins' boats. Every Allied victory that depended on landing troops over open beaches was made possible by a man the Navy didn't want. Eisenhower understood. The Navy refused his boats, but Higgins built them anyway, and they won the war.